a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Dr. Dursun and also Professor Zawel for inviting me. Likewise, I'm very sorry that we're not meeting in person because we are geographically very close, but such is the situation. What I'll do is I am going to share slides for the beginning of the talk, but since I realized that with this platform, it makes me, the speaker, very small, I'll then turn off the slides for the probably, well, the majority of the talk. So let me just get that up. And then you'll see me, I think, in quite small square. So I hope that you can follow. But because of some of the conceptual apparatus that I use, I prefer to still keep this for the beginning. I think as many of you know, if not everybody who's joining this talk, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has become a poster boy for his self-described illiberal democracy. Sorry, I already realized there's a problem with the first slide because the picture got moved, but the question at the top is, what does Orban represent? And I think that's the crucial question that I'm trying to deal with in this talk. Many still struggle to identify the right vocabulary, the right conceptual apparatus for understanding what the Orban regime represents, the type of political force that it represents. So terms that we've seen are, for example, that he's a populist radical right leader, that he's authoritarian or a strongman, that in his own terms, he's developed a kind of novel illiberal democracy. And then I think more in the popular press, one might see that he's described as fascist or neo-fascist and so on. But I argue in this talk, which is based on a forthcoming article in Theory, Culture, and Society, that Orban has gone well beyond any of these terms, and that actually none of these terms really adequately represent the kind of political regime that he has developed and in which I think he's really at the avant-garde. And so what I do in this paper is I employ a Gramscian method to analyze holistically the Orban regime, especially with tools developed by Gramscian sociologists Bob Jessop. So I'm very inspired in this work by the work of Bob Jessop, a British sociologist who developed, I think, some of the most interesting work on transformations of the capitalist state under neoliberalism. And so such a framing, I argue, helps identify the overall logic of the contemporary political society shaped by Orban and his party, Fidesz, and the interlinkages between the social, political, and economic projects he has advanced. So what I argue here is that this method helps me identify the neoliberal intensifications, but also some of the ruptures to neoliberalism exemplified by the current Hungarian state. And so to this end, I think it's fruitful to analyze contemporary responses to crises of neoliberal hegemony by returning to some scholarship from the 1980s on Thatcherism. Now, Thatcherism, as identified or as labeled, I think, quite famously by British cultural Marxist Stuart Hall in the 1980s, represented, according to Hall, the resurgence of authoritarian tendencies apparent in liberal democracies. Hall's analysis, I think, was especially strong in pointing to crises of hegemony, and which Hall saw as producing a form of authoritarian populism with a kind of pearl necklace, and then he coined famously the term Thatcherism. And then in a robust debate in this British Marxist milieu in the 1980s, Bob Jessop debated with Hall the usefulness of the term Thatcherism, whether it really captured enough of what was going on. And he moved from analyzing Thatcherism, that is Jessop, moved from analyzing Thatcherism to analyzing neoliberalism. So I think much of the conceptual vocabulary that we use today to discuss Thatcherism and neoliberalism really hearken from this incredibly rich debate in the 1980s and in the early 1990s within British Marxism. So Jessop then went on to develop a very sophisticated view of neoliberalism as having produced a novel regime of social reproduction and labor regulation, but also crucially, and I think this is one of his really important contributions, that it also changed the role and form of the capitalist state. Despite some notable differences, Hall and Jessup each assessed that the economic crisis of the 1970s and also the political responses then in the 1980s had marked a new phase in the capitalist state. But then appearance of a social democratic third way, particularly in the 1990s, appeared to soften the authoritarian tendencies of 1980s Thatcherism. But some 40 years later, I think we can say that neoliberalism's softer face is starting to harden again. And the crisis in democratic institutions that we see today is linked to the crises of capitalism since the Great Recession of 2008. So I draw from Hall's Thatcherism and Jessup's regime-level neoliberalism and his Gramscian view of the state as a social relation to identify what is old and new in the Orban regime. That is, I identify the authoritarian tendencies of the state which Orban exemplifies, but also how he has transformed what I think by now we can call the classical neoliberal state. So his regime contains elements of neoliberal continuity, but at the same time, it's what I argue is post-neoliberal, especially in its reconfiguration of the state. This is now a state, and I'll develop this extensively over the course of the talk, that seeks to reassert its autonomy from the international institutions which had become the policing agents of global capitalism, especially in their heyday in the 1990s, and which seeks to enforce its own role as a key arbiter in domestic marketization, class reproduction, and domestic capital accumulation. So Orban has not only steered the Hungarian state into a neoliberal authoritarian form, but also has been a pathbreaker, I think really, as I said earlier, in the avant-garde in fostering a post-neoliberal hegemony. And this hegemony I call ordo-nationalist. So please bear with me because again, it's a term that it's a kind of portmanteau that I put together, and I'll describe in a lot of detail what I mean by it. And so I argue that ordo-nationalism as a post-neoliberal regime of state-society relations incorporates three dimensions. The first is the recomposition of the capitalist state, which is no longer the hollowed out state identified by Jessup, but rather a selectively powerful and authoritarian state. And this includes ordo-liberal style economic policy. So when I'm referring to ordo-liberalism, what I'm referencing is a school of economic thought which had a very prominent position at the University of Freiburg in the 1930s, which emphasized protection and enhancement of national capitalist markets through a very strong national state. So both pro-capitalist, but also pro-state. And so the ordo-nationalist state invests enormous power in making domestic labor flexible, and also, I argue, in enabling access to consumption, and in controlling, and this is crucial, controlling access to capitalist accumulation. But there's also a recomposition of the state. So the neoliberal state, which Jessup had analyzed in the 1990s, was a state which he argued was succumbing to the increased role of supranational governance in the form of, for example, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and so on, but also to subnational governance in competition over capital investment. So in other words, the state which Jessup called, the neoliberal state which Jessup called a hollowed out state, was a state that at the national state level was losing its power and its capacity to regulate domestic capitalism. But what we see with the ordo-nationalist state, okay, so this is a portmanteau where I combine the concept of ordo, so the state which strongly orders, and hyper-nationalism, is that we see aggressive moves by the actors who take over the central state to take back control of governance at all levels, including urban governance, regional cooperation, and a reconcentration of power in the national state, especially when it comes to the role of the national economy and capital accumulation within the web of global capitalism. So the national state has made a comeback. So, and this is one that it also extends neoliberalism through this very powerful muscular state by pushing further for labor flexibility, minimizing all the more redistribution across classes, stripping down the welfare state, and even a more radical form of workfare policy. So it combines already this dual aspect of both extending tendencies within neoliberalism, but also transforming them by taking the state back. The second dimension, which I'm not going to develop a lot in this paper because I think at some level it's what's best known, at least in the public media, about the Orban regime, is that it entails state capture. So the national state is captured by an individual or a party as a means toward controlling the state and access to capital accumulation. Pluralist democracy, as we saw in Hungary, is emptied of any genuine content. And the strategic logic of the accumulation of power is one where control over the state is intensely oriented towards controlling access to capital and domestic labor markets, and also controlling capitalist accumulation domestically. This is, I'll discuss this more in detail. I'm going to unpack all of these dimensions I'm going to put more flesh on them with giving examples from specific events and policies that have unfolded in Hungary. But what I'll emphasize later is that this is absolutely connected to phenomena like the rise of oligarchies and the development of oligarchic dependencies. But what I argue is that this dimension is very much related also to the first dimension, which is the importance of seizing back the state. And then the third component is a novel regime of social reproduction, which links financialisation and middle-class pronatalism. I'll give more examples of this later. Even further flexibilization of labor, a steep decline in support of the welfare state and redistribution across class, near abandonment of the poorest, and dedicating, and I think this is a quite novel aspect, which I now see I forgot to put on the slide, dedicating state resources to enabling consumption as a source of social reproduction. And the new middle class in particular is cultivated as the critical beneficiary. It is the chosen class. This regime ideologically promotes what I call neoliberal populism, which not only reduces redistribution and espouses neoliberal morality, but goes even beyond neoliberal workfarism, so that the poorest, and not just ethnic outsiders, are outside the people. So the poor are now outside the people. And it also cultivates racist, patriarchal, and nationalist ideologies, which attempt to foster internal solidarities within the nation, regardless of class, and also regardless of starkly expanding inequalities, and even deny the politics of class, and which are exclusionary through racial, gendered, and ethnic boundaries. Seizing back the state has also entailed a strategy of reviving the nation, so that the nation component is very important. The party and the leader at its helm is the decisive and strong leader of an essentialized national body. So with all of that in mind, with that whole big conceptual apparatus, I'm actually going to stop sharing the slides. I just have to remember how to do it. And I'll actually, let me just show you this slide. So what I'm going to do now is, I'm not sure if you can actually see my cursor. I'm assuming that you can. So I'm going to unpack all of these dimensions with giving you examples from policies and political processes that have unfolded in Hungary. And I'm going to spend more time, especially on the third dimension, which was firstly what I promised Professor Zawa, and secondly was the center of the title of the talk. This is a paper and a talk which doesn't have as strong of a normal. It doesn't have as strong of a gender emphasis, which is unusual for me because almost all of my scholarship centers on gender politics. So the paper on the whole only introduces it as part of the dimension within this overall regime, and I'll try to emphasize it as the talk proceeds. So let me stop the share so you can hopefully see me now as a bigger square at the center of your screen. Okay, so the first dimension that I said I would give more flesh to was this idea of a reconfigured nationalist state, and a kind of comeback of the national state. So observing over a decade of Orban's rule in Hungary by now, it's clear that when Orban was elected, or I should say re-elected in 2010, he intended to ruthlessly take back control of the state. And of paramount importance was a plan to position the Hungarian state as the prime authority in steering domestic capitalism. Now, well before his re-election in 2010, anti-neoliberal conservative intellectuals helped pave the way towards the Fidesz party's worldview, which combined a nostalgia for a strong sovereign state, but then increasingly an anti-welfare state ideology. And responding precisely to the loss of state autonomy, which many post-socialist governments had accepted in the 1990s and 2000s as a price to pay for participation in global capitalism, Orban renationalized certain sectors of the Hungarian economy. And his re-election in 2010 was thanks in part to a campaign which promised economic rule and which paved the way to then further re-election in 2014. And so this included, as part of his political campaign, a powerful critique of the IMF, the World Bank, and a strategy of what some political scientists call financial nationalism. So here I'm especially using the term coined by Juliet Johnson and Andrew Barnes, who describe it as pursuing monetary sovereignty and privileging insiders within the national economy. Now, insiders in Orban's version of financial nationalism, and I think in nearly all aspects of his rule, are those who show loyalty to Orban the person and to his Fidesz party, which I develop a little bit more in the second dimension. In some respects, one can say that Hungary undertook a renationalization of key sectors of the domestic economy. But renationalization needs to be understood as a novel form of financial nationalism, which extends in selective ways also the logic of neoliberalism. Whereas nationalization used to mean direct state ownership of key economic sectors or service provision, sometimes via expropriation. In today's Hungary, it has entailed strategic use of legal or economic sections aimed at reducing foreign-owned private capital in Hungary in specific sectors, and then either direct state ownership of the vacuums created once foreign capital is forced to depart, or ensuring that loyal domestic capitalists take over those sectors. And there are many examples of that. Because of time, I'm not going through all the details. So political economists Agnes Gagyi and Tomasz Geruch note how Orban made state interventions into sectors such as telecommunications, transport, banking, media, by mobilizing the Fidesz majority parliament to pass sometimes obscure laws that were really designed to redistribute these sectors away from foreign capital investment and away also simultaneously from political rivals, and then concentrate ownership of those sectors within national oligarchic dependence. Prior to Orban's re-election, Hungary's sovereign debt had reached as much as 60 to 80% of its GDP. And the Socialist Party, which shouldn't confuse those who aren't so familiar with Hungary, because that's basically the third way party of the post-socialist era, enacted austerity measures and state asset privatization to cut the government deficit and to meet the conditionality of IMF loans. Following the 2008 global crisis, the socialist government took on yet more debt from the IMF and the World Bank. Orban's 2010 re-election campaign vowed to end Hungary's indebtedness, especially to the IMF and the World Bank. And indeed, he's done this, but it's also thanks largely to turning to Russia and China, in particular, for loans of undisclosed sums. Sorry, you might hear the bells behind me, which will help me stay on time. So there are many, many more such examples. There are important continuities and ruptures then between what Jessup identified as what he called, in his very particular language, the Schumpeterian workfare state, the SWS, and what I call the ordo-nationalist state. The objectives of the neoliberal Schumpeterian workfare state, the SWS, according to Jessup, had been to strengthen the competitiveness of the national economy by intervening on the supply side and to subordinate social policy to the needs of labor market flexibility for the purpose of international competition over capital investment. And during what we can call now the classical neoliberal era of the state, this went hand in hand with the hollowing out of the national level of the state. The national state was weakened by its dependency upon the dynamics of global capitalism, a situation which Jessup diagnosed as leading to national states' loss of autonomy. So on the one hand, Orban extended some of these tendencies by doing a selective kind of privatization. He both renationalized and privatized. He nationalized via the state and then extended privatization, but also by ensuring that it was oligarchic dependents loyal to him and to the party, who were the prime investors and owners of capital. Sorry, I'll just take a sip of water, and now there's a second bell. Maybe I should wait. I don't know how long it goes on for. Okay, so in so doing, as I've repeated, and maybe by now it's going to sound like a mantra, but it is a central aspect of this paper, which is that Orban has in so doing also reasserted the autonomy of the Hungarian state, which includes wresting back control over subnational governance, especially currently a battle over control of the capital city of Budapest, and also controlling flows of investment across subregions in the national territory. As a more recent example, but was really from the spring, as one of the emergency powers that were enacted by the Hungarian parliament due to the pandemic, the Orban regime now has more control over the regional investment strategies of specific cities and specific regions in Hungary. How that relates precisely to the pandemic is a little obscure. Okay, the second dimension that I'll talk about, but much more briefly, because again, I think that this is really actually something that is the best known aspect of the Orban regime, or one of the best known aspects, is this aspect of state capture or ordo-nationalist. Oh, okay, sorry, I got the note. Is the capture of the state. Here, let me move my computer away so that there's less rustling of papers. Sorry about that. So here I argue that the clientelism, corruption, and oligarchic drift, which Hungary has now become famous, if not infamous, are related to the first process that I just talked about. Since the ordo-nationalist regime seeks to control capital accumulation within its national state territory, It also orders the totality of social, or at least tries to order the totality of social, political, and economic relations to center select political elites as those who not only benefit from capitalist accumulation, but also direct it from above. And central to this is cultivation of a loyal and highly dependent capitalist bourgeoisie. Hungarian political scientist Bálint Magyar has called this a mafia state, a diagnosis which I think is indisputable, but which I think needs to be placed within a broader analysis of the social political regime this is part of. The post-neoliberal path towards accumulation of power, encapsulated by the ordo-nationalist politician, is to accumulate power by displaying unswerving loyalty to the party and state leader, to eschew the neoliberal orthodoxy represented by institutions like the IMF or the World Bank, and to no longer pretend that a politician is autonomous from access to capitalist profit via the state. Sociologist Ivan Seleny deploys the Weberian concept of prebendalism to describe the current Hungarian relation between state capital and political power. So office holding, political office holding entails gatekeeping others' access to profit, and if fully exploited, is a path to office holders' own accumulation of private property and profit. And clients, in turn, have to show loyalty to party and political leader to attain contracts, access profit, or even just keep their jobs. So ordo-nationalism is distinct from oligarchy, but ordo-nationalism eases the path towards oligarchic drift. I'm just going to pause for a moment and ask, are you seeing me in the center, or am I still a little square in the bottom? I don't know if
you're at the center, bigger.
Okay, fine. All right, because for myself, I'm a little square in the bottom, but as long as
me too. But I think this is how we see ourselves. But you're in a good size, let's say.
Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, the third dimension, which is from neoliberal to post-neoliberal social reproduction. The ordo-nationalist state has hollowed out its former role in decommodification through the welfare state. And Orban instead, or Orbanism, enables access to consumption as a key driver for social reproduction. So this is not the consumption model of the classic Keynesian welfare state, which aimed at providing full employment in a relatively closed national economy. But it's also no longer the neoliberal Schumpeterian workfare state that Jessup described. So as we know well by now, sorry, I'm losing my voice. The neoliberal welfare state, or at least the neoliberalized welfare state, ceased redistributing across class, or at least reduced redistribution across class, commodified workers through workfare policies, reduced protection of workers from market fluctuations and periods of unemployment, and especially disciplined labor so that it could remain flexible enough to be competitive in a global capitalist market. And in this regard, Orban's regime has actually implemented some fairly classical neoliberal policy. For example, the Socialist Party in power during the 1990s and early 2000s had already implemented a workfarist regime in Hungary. But the Fidesz government in 2011 further tightened workfare rules, making them more punitive and more meager. And it's really, I think, the work of CEU sociologist Eva Fodor, whose work I think is really important in tracing this transformation. It also transitioned from workfare to creating a mandatory public works program, shifting their management from municipalities to the national state. So again, this scaling from local governments back up to the national state. But also the minimum wage for participation in the new public works program was changed to a special rate at 70% of the already very low national minimum wage. Hungary also has the lowest corporate tax rate in Europe at 9%. And thanks to low corporate and also employer taxes, it attracts companies such as Mercedes-Benz, Opel, and BMW, and which provide, all of which provide working class and middle class employment, but of course with lower salaries and benefits paid to Hungarians compared to workers in West Europe. So aimed at neoliberal style competition over global capitalist investment, the guarantee of low wages and low employer costs and low corporate taxes have somewhat backfired, well, especially the low wages, by creating deep labor shortages in Hungary. So workers have been living for years for higher paying jobs in Western Europe or elsewhere in the European Union. But at the same time, Orban's xenophobic and nationalist regime limits specific migrant flows into national borders, resulting in heavy-handed top-down liberalization and forced flexibilization of native, mostly white labor markets. In an authoritarian move to solve the contradiction of deeply flexibilizing labor, so in other words, on the one hand, extending neoliberal tendencies to attract capital investment, but then resulting in Hungarian outmigration into the EU to find employment, with a nationalist xenophobic limitation on migration into Hungary, the so-called slave law, as it was popularly called at the time, was passed in late 2018 by the Hungarian parliament. Responding to these labor shortages, primarily in German car manufacturing, the Hungarian parliament passed the law in a matter of hours, allowing employers to demand up to 400 hours of overtime work from employees, and with a delay of wage compensation to as long as 3 years after the overtime work had been completed. I think of equal importance, rather than aiming towards significant national production of commodities for consumption, and also having appropriate wages for consumption, the national economy is presumed to be nested within a global political economy in which it's preferable to foster free trade and low tariffs to enable to enable any amount of consumption. So unlike the Keynesian welfare state, pinpoint reindustrialization, such as with car manufacturing, is not aimed at creating commodities for national consumption, but rather it's a node within global chains of production and trade. In this regime, even unlike the classical neoliberal workfare state, labor is not the central vector of state-citizens relations. Instead, consumption is crucial. The ordo-nationalist state doesn't significantly invest in social reproduction. It supports consumption for those who can afford to consume. According to OECD reports, poverty in Hungary has increased since 2007. An estimated 35% of Hungarians are considered materially deprived, and 19% in this report are considered severely deprived. Both indicators are double the EU average. Investment in direct social reproduction is low. A joint EU and OECD report shows that Hungary ranks low within Europe in public healthcare expenditures, spending half of the average per capita spending in the EU. And anyone who has had to face the public health system or the public education system knows how severely underfunded these systems are. So Orban nationalism goes even further than the classic neoliberal state in its punishment of the poorest and most vulnerable. And this is exemplified in the Fidesz party's approach, or the government's approach to homelessness. Homelessness had already been criminalized in Hungary as of 2012, but shortly after Orban's resounding re-election in 2018, the Fidesz-controlled parliament went even further by passing a bill to amend the constitution with a provision which enshrines the criminality of living in public spaces. So this is what I call neoliberal populism, which not only punishes the poorest and most vulnerable, but renders the poorest as outside the people. The Orban government's introduction of a flat income tax, which is 15%, alongside introduction of the highest VAT in Europe at 27%, captures also the shift from redistribution between citizens and also redistribution between classes to a relation pivoting around consumption. Citizens, in turn, are rewarded with access to consumption, and the state tracks revenues from consumption taxes. And just as Orban nationalist policy intensified some neoliberal workfare tendencies, it's also intensified, and I think this is a new dimension, citizens' financialization. So on the surface, Orban saved many Hungarian households from the consequences of financialization during a mortgage crisis in 2011. Hungarian home ownership had been financialized well before 2010 through post-socialist mass privatization of home ownership. And to help support this mass home ownership scheme, Hungarians had been encouraged under the post-socialist socialist government to take foreign low-interest bank mortgages denominated in Swiss francs. And when the Hungarian forint plummeted relative to the Swiss franc in 2011, so this was shortly after his 2010 re-election, Orban decreed that foreign banks who had lent to Hungarians had to accept an artificially lowered currency exchange rate, and that banks would have to shoulder the losses. So this financial nationalism made Orban appear like a populist hero. But on the other hand, Orban has also selectively financialized Hungarian households in policies that simultaneously financialize but also support desired populations. One example is the so-called baby bonds, which can be purchased by Hungarians with the birth of a child. They're guaranteed to pay a yield that is 3% higher than the average rate of inflation. And Hungary has historically had a relatively weak middle class, even compared to its socialist and post-socialist neighbors. And since the post-socialist period, this is still the case. So Orban has heavily invested in enlarging Hungary's new middle class, which is a development that I think is really socially and politically significant. A collective book project comparing ethnographies of the new middle class globally called, the title of the book is called The Global Middle Classes, I think very helpfully distinguishes between the traditional middle classes, such as educated professionals or those bearing cultural capital, with what they call the new global middle class of developing economies. This new global middle class is employed in private sectors, benefiting from neoliberalizing economies, and their consumption style compared to traditional middle classes is more Western-oriented and more deeply integrated into global capitalism, at the same time as it can actually be aligned with quite conservative political projects. So whereas in the development world and development scholarship of the Cold War and post-Cold War era, one of the key markers of development and also supposed democratization was supposed to be the development of national middle classes. But what's interesting in Hungary, and which I think there are many other countries in which we can see this, is that in fact the new middle class, this new global middle class, is not aligned with democratization and can even be seen as a force which is counter to democratization. And this Hungarian new middle class, as argued by anthropologist Christina Fehérváry, is oriented around property ownership, where single-family houses signify one's status hierarchy, especially as superior to rural peasants and the declining working class. And so far, Hungary's new middle class appears to be quite satisfied with its newfangled capacity to consume, the flat income tax, the ability to have open borders within Europe, and the opportunities for lifestyle and consumption that affords. And is wooed also by Orban's housing policies, which tie middle-class home ownership to promotion of middle-class childbirth. Middle-class reproduction is oriented around a series of policy packages rolled out since 2017. Crucially, they also re-emphasize, or emphasize even more than ever, women's reproductive roles. And here we see where nationalism converges with a resurgence of patriarchal and sometimes implicit and sometimes explicit racist ideologies. One policy offers, for example, a loan to each woman under 40 who marries, and then progressive debt reduction with the birth of children and debt cancellation with the birth of the third child. Another policy from 2017 first supported home purchasing by offering state-subsidized mortgages and deductions for married couples who commit to having at least 3 children, while a more recent reform reduces the commitment to 2 children. But those employed through the public work schemes aren't eligible for the mortgage benefits. And with skyrocketing privatized university tuition costs, that's a whole domain that I don't have time to talk about, which is the privatization also of the higher education sector and skyrocketing tuition prices for university tuition. The government has offered student loans which will be forgiven after the birth of a third child. So relatively privileged citizens become financialized subjects at a young age and then are definancialized by the state to procreate enough and show commitment to demographic national renewal. Now, these schemes are not overtly racist, but since Roma are overrepresented in Hungarian public works programs and can't be eligible for these loan privileges, these policies have deeply racialized effects. And only those who can shoulder debt can take on debt. In other words, citizens have to have already a certain amount of economic or social capital in order to be beneficiaries of these policies. The new middle class, and to some degree peasant workers, have been provided a flow of access to commodities within Hungary, in part thanks to cooperation with the Chinese Belt and Road project, and also Russian energy subsidies, which I'm not describing in detail. It's a political economy of enabling citizens to consume cheap stuff in a country where citizens still remember shortages and state socialist austerity. Hungary's appearance of affluence is also fueled by mass budget tourism, giving Budapest, at least prior to the pandemic, a superficial gloss of being a cosmopolitan city of sophisticated consumption. But I see Budapest as the nationalist city par excellence. It provides the appearance of prosperity and access to consumption for its own inhabitants and also to tourists of modest means who are themselves not the real winners of global capitalism. So I'm going to conclude here with a very brief conclusion, because I think I've spoken enough. And I'm not returning to the slides because I'm not convinced that they add enough. Except, you know what? I'm gonna show one slide, just because it has an image that might be appreciated. So. I would have tied to the section when I was discussing the development of the new middle class, the emphasis on home ownership, on houses, on housing, and private property ownership. This happens to be a new construction that was neighboring where I was living in Budapest, and I think it's just really emblematic of the development of the new middle class. It's a gated house, which is utterly unnecessary an extremely safe city and an extremely safe neighborhood. You can see that the tastes are the taste is modernist. It looks cosmopolitan. But if you look closely here, there's a little image of the Virgin Mary that has inserted into this otherwise very kind of classically modernist structure. All right, let me just go back to a really quick conclusion, because I'm sure you want to have a break. So as I hope to have effectively conveyed, I think that the Orban regime is much more than one of simply democratic backslide or populist or authoritarian. While on the one hand, I am of the opinion, like many, that neoliberalism is a term that's become overused in the past 15 years. What I've argued today is that I do think that it's still useful in understanding the ways in which the Orban regime both extends some of the tendencies of the neoliberal state and neoliberal regimes of social reproduction, but then also the ways in which Orban's Hungary can be defined as departing from it and as even post-neoliberal. And this regime type that I call ordo-nationalist is meant to capture these tendencies, the extensions and the divergences from the classical neoliberal state. It's meant also to help us go beyond 20th century conceptual categories, the vocabulary from the 20th century that I think still, which I think currently limits our ability to correctly diagnose the present. And perhaps the term and the concept can even help us get a glimpse of the future. So thank you for your time and attention.